All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our ABA International Human Rights Committee's program in honor of International Human Rights Day. I am Tiffani Brownley-Meijer. I am a human rights and business and human rights attorney and also co-chair of our International Human Rights Committee. Um, we we celebrate the International Declaration of Human, well, sorry, excuse me. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the seminal leading document enshrining fundamental rights. It was adopted by the UN General Assembly in Paris on December 10th, 1948. 2 years later, in 1950, the UN established the annual observance, inviting all member states to celebrate in a manner of their choosing. It's for this reason that we have celebrated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on what is now Human Rights Day by shining a light on human rights issues and the work being done to further fundamental rights and their protections. Since its adoption, the world has witnessed increased and prolonged conflicts, necessitating an international convention on to prevent and punish crimes against humanity as a legal framework for justice and accountability. Yet, as progress has been made towards adopting a Crimes Against Humanity Convention, we have experienced great political shifts, reordering nations' priorities and realigning their alliances. Today, we have convened this panel to address the current landscape surrounding the convention, given current conflicts, geopolitical realignments, and the role of organizations in moving towards its adoption. Today's format will include an introduction of our panelists, followed by a presentation by each panelist, a discussion amongst the speakers, and then Q&A. We invite everyone to post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will take questions at the end. We ask that each of the speakers have time to present do their presentations, and we will have interventions among them afterwards. So we are fortunate to have the following distinguished panel of experts. First, we have Baroness Kennedy, who is one of the United Kingdom's most distinguished lawyers. She is a member of the Bar, a King's Counsel, a bencher of Gray's Inn, and the director of the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. She was created a life peer in 1997 and has been a strong advocate for social justice and the rule of law in the House of Lords. She has recently been awarded the Order of the Thistle, the highest honor in Scotland. She is the founder of the Bonnevero Institute of Human Rights at Oxford in 2018. In 2021, when Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, Baroness Kennedy evacuated 102 women judges and prosecutors who were on death lists with their families, so the total number was 508, by raising the funds, securing safe houses, chartering planes, and resettling the women around the world. Baroness Kennedy is currently the chair of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. She is also working with the president of Ukraine on war crimes and trying to recover thousands of children who have been abducted from Ukraine by Russian forces. She has received an Order of Merit from the president for this work. Next, we have Stephen Richmond. Stephen Richmond is a member of Clark Hill PLC. He has written and spoken extensively in the areas of international law, business and human rights, contracts, litigation, arbitration, and professional responsibility. He is a past chair of the American Bar Association's International Law Section, serves in its House of Delegates, and is the ABA representative to the United Nations. He's the chair of the ABA's Center for Human Rights Executive Board, chair of the International Bar Association's Bar Issues Commission, and chairs the Business and Human Rights Commission of the UIA, International Association of Lawyers. He also serves on the New York Bar Association Business and Human Rights Committee and its council. He has served as an American Bar Association advisor, to the Uniform Law Commission on Asset Freezing Orders, as well as on the Hague Judgments Convention, Singapore Mediation Convention, and the Choice of Courts Agreements Convention. He is a recipient of the American Bar Association's International Law Section Leonard Theberge Award for Private International Law, as well as the section's Lifetime Achievement Award. Last but not least, and who will be joining us a bit later, we have Professor Leila Sadat, who is the James Carr Professor of International Criminal Law at Washington University and a visiting law professor at Yale Law School from 2021 to 2024. She has served as special advisor on crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court Prosecutor from 2013 to 2023 and is on the registered list of experts for the Moscow mechanism of the OACE. In 2008, Leila launched the Crimes Against Humanity initiative to write the world's first global treaty on crimes against humanity and continues to spearhead its negotiation and adoption. She is the chair of the International Law Association American Branch, a member of the American Law Institute, and the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, has held leadership positions in many other learned societies, and is a member of the board of editors of the Journal of International Criminal Justice. She recently joined the advisory council for the International Nuremberg Principles Academy and the board of Eyewitness to Atrocities. So we will begin this presentation by starting with Baroness Kennedy, if we can. Can you lead us off by giving us a background on what you see as some of the geopolitical challenges that are basically attacking some of our international institutions for accountability? By that, I mean, can you tell us the significance of the progress made with the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, one, the more important role of EU, UK, and nations and international organizations in supporting the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, and what the current geopolitical realignment means for justice and accountability overall?
Tiffani, it's my great pleasure to be joining the American Bar Association. I am someone who, as a very young lawyer, came and did an internship with a big law firm in the United States, and it introduced me to the American Constitution. It made me a constitutional reformer back in Britain. It taught me so much about the rights of citizens and the importance of the protections, and essentially that you were a country that was based on law. And so I can't begin this conversation without saying that it's been a source of sadness to me to see, even in your country, that great place of laws, what I think are erosions of the rule of law. And so when we talk about geopolitics, we can't forget the role that the United States has played in the world as being this incredibly inspirational democracy, this place that people really looked to. And of course, in many ways, it's right that Europe shouldn't continue to always expect that the United States is going to be there at its back. But at the same time, to lose America there at our back is a real problem. The United States has been an inspiration to the world in what it stood for. And so it's with some concern that I think that we are seeing some steps backwards, and that affects the whole of the world, because people are taking their lead from what they see and imagine is taking place. I was very alarmed at the national security strategy that was published only last Saturday, because it seemed, well, it tells you everything when it was greeted by President Putin and the Kremlin as being, as they're saying, that they were largely really rather content and happy with the report, and said that it followed Moscow's vision. And of course, what you were saying was that in that strategy document, it says that Russia is not a threat to the United States. Well, I have to say that here in Europe, we feel that Russia is a very serious threat to democracies across Europe. And we somehow had imagined that the United States would be standing with us. Um, when you asked me that question about really the geopolitical changes in the world, it's a major change in the world when the United States is saying that it's no longer that committed to that rules-based order that was created after the Second World War. I always say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came out of course, that the experience of the war. But the United States, was at the heart of the creation of this new world order, and I always say I would have loved to have been there in the apartment in Washington Square, where Eleanor Roosevelt invited jurists and judges and lawyers from around the world to sit down, and the conversation was about how can we prevent horrors happening again? How can we prevent crimes of aggression? How can we create peace and justice? And of course, the only way you get justice and peace is if, as long as there's accountability and there's no impunity. And law is vital in all of that. And so you know, all societies have tried to create rules by which they live. And of course, as our world has become closer and more connected through all the different ways in which human ingenuity has created ways of connectivity, we should be actually the closer together and working together globally. And laws are important in doing that, just as they, create, strengthen, and protect relationships internally in a nation. So you need to have similar laws that work across between nations, so that all those relationships have legal parameters, if you like. And and so when you ask about the geopolitics and what is happening in our world, there have been huge changes. At the moment, we've got more conflicts going on than I think that we've seen at any one time, except in world wars. And it does mean that law is needed, and yet we see law being trammeled at every turn. And we also see that the institutions of accountability, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the potential, for example, for dealing with the crime of aggression that was committed by Russia towards Ukraine, where the sovereignty of a nation should matter and should count for something. And we somehow see none of that seeming to matter. And so I have to say that I'm feeling very anguished about the state of law globally, inside our nations, because we all end up copying each other, and we are affected culturally by experiences in other nations. And I'm seeing, for example, erosions here in Europe and in the United Kingdom, in many ways emulating things that are happening in the United States. That business of somehow putting on a pedestal the idea of deregulation, that all aspects of our lives in some ways involve some regulation. And I'm afraid that the commitment to deregulation, above all else, seems to be inhibiting us from doing some of the things that need to be done in our contemporary world. You asked very specifically about crimes against humanity. I mean, what was Eleanor Roosevelt doing with? I'm sure she's not a heroine of many in the current administration in your country, but she's a pretty heroic character, because she said that crimes against humanity and the whole business of human rights starts in small places close to home. And so we always point out that it matters as much in care homes as it does in courtrooms. That it works. It's important as much in the places in which we work, in workplaces, as it is in hospitals and in all the different aspects of our lives. Should touch upon issues of human rights. And when people came together around Eleanor Roosevelt's table, it was basically to say there are values that we all share. We all want to. None of us want to be tortured. We all want to put a ban on the idea of torturing people, and we also know that it doesn't work in securing evidence and so forth. But the other thing is that we all want to see due process, and so there's great concern about the absence of due process increasingly in so many places, that we're seeing so many erosions of things that we took for granted. And one of the things that came out of that was to create a template of human rights that would apply to all of our legal systems. And I'm afraid that is being forgotten currently. And there's a lot of copying of great nations, really pushing to one side the legal requirements and obligations that nations were supposed to have. Now, you asked about the Convention on Crimes Against Humanity. I have to say that I feel very despondent about it. If you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have said we're on a trajectory where crimes against humanity will be acknowledged, and there'll be a convention about what that means and what would be included in that. And I think that one of the things, look at the incredible thing that's happening in Afghanistan, where women are being deprived of their most basic rights. They don't have access to education. They don't have access to proper health care. They are being denied freedom of association, freedom of expression. They can't even sing. They can't even speak in public. They're being denied the most basic of rights. They can't participate in how their nation should be governed, how there can be debates about what is needed by a nation that faces many problems, and the special subjugation of women, because basically they're being kept in a place that is not equal in rights or in dignity in any shape or form. And yet the world is remaining silent about it. Yes, arrest warrants were issued by the International Criminal Court against the leadership, and yet at the same time, we know nothing is going to be done about that, and we know that the world is not listening to what is really happening there. But it's happening in the conflicts too, where there were rules established in the Fourth Geneva Convention about how war should be conducted, and they're completely being ignored with incredible transgressions that without the protections of civilians, without and there's with without a thought, destruction of residential buildings, of hospitals, of people who are supplying food to people, all of that, which was laid down as because we learned lessons from the Second World War, where people were starved, where there was a bombardment, like in Dresden or in Coventry in my own country, where huge numbers of civilians were killed. And it was to prevent all of that. And unfortunately, in conflicts now, civilians are basically part and parcel of those who have to be destroyed. So I'm not very optimistic, because without the great nations, the voices of great nations, and particularly the United States, which was so important to all of this, I feel very pessimistic at the moment about the rule of law and the rules-based order. I have to tell you that.
Thank you so much. Um, Stephen, would you like to make any interventions, since we still have extra time, about some of the presentation that the Baroness just gave?
Well, I was going to go into my presentation, but
Okay.
I'll make a couple of just brief comments. And I know the Baroness for a very long time, and I consider us good friends. I'm not quite as pessimistic as she is. I think that, as I've said several times when I've spoken at the IBA and elsewhere on this, there are guardrails in the United States, and they have been tested going back to the founding of the Republic. And I always use the example of President Andrew Jackson, who openly defied the Supreme Court, resulting in the death of many Native Americans. And it's an apocryphal comment, but it captured the essence of his attitude was, if Chief Justice Marshall has an army, let him use it. Basically, you've had presidents do this. And he subsequently, not too much longer after that, then reaffirmed the Marbury versus Madison, the role of judicial review and the process of the courts. So without getting into the politics currently in the United States, I simply point out that within the institutional framework of the U.S., we still do have these guardrails. Many of the things that the current administration is doing are challenged. They're going through the courts. Certain people may not like results one way or the other, but the process continues. And we do have a robust dialogue within the United States of criticism. I'm not naive and I'm not a Pollyanna, but I do think it's important to point out that when we have an abstract discussion, we still do have, the framework of the rule of law, and so far, it seems to be holding. There are certain acts that have occurred that perhaps are I would agree, challenging and put extra pressure on. But that said, to try to turn it to our topic, the notion of defense of human rights, this too has been at the core of the United States. And if anything, the Declaration of Independence and its 250 years is coming up next year. And the preamble is an assertion, somewhat new, but based on European philosophical concepts too, John Locke and otherwise, of the importance of the individual, of human rights, the pursuit of happiness, these types of things. So I think it's important to remember the framework. And maybe I can then segue into my presentation as to why what I've just said matters. To paraphrase Andrew Jackson, perhaps, the bar associations don't have armies. We don't break kneecaps. We issue statements. We are shining a light. We are a global voice. And as I added to my little description there, I wear multiple hats. I've been ABA representative to the United Nations. I chair currently the ABA Center for Human Rights, and I'm chair of the Bar Issues Commission, which also addresses many of the issues we've talked about here today in terms of human rights. We've established working groups in both these organizations. I'm somewhat of a common denominator to those because it's important to have a global coordination of legal voices on this topic. I will give credit to my friend Baroness Kennedy, who first introduced me to the notion of gender apartheid. And inspired by that, I brought that to the American Bar Association, where we passed a resolution a couple of years ago endorsing the notion that in any convention on crimes against humanity, where the definition of apartheid is at issue, it should include gender apartheid. So the American Bar Association has gone on record. And therefore, when we have spoken, and I've been on those conversations with the State Department as to the U.S. point of view, say, on this convention, I've referenced that, and they're aware of it. Again, without an army, what do we do as a bar? When I was in college, one of the most fundamental books I read was Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And he talks about the paradigm. And before you can have a change in scientific thinking, you need to change the paradigm. And it's the same thing here. After World War II, the IBA was founded with the same kind of notion that we need global, like the United Nations, global concourse. Connectivity among the different entities. And I think what we're building here, with the example I just gave of the gender apartheid resolution, or other things, you'll be happy to know, Baroness, that I've even taken the IBA child marriage resolution that you've done, and that's going in the ABA process as well. I've taken that up. So what we do, and we are changing the paradigm. If you were to talk 45, 50 years ago about business and human rights, you would not have the same audience and receptivity that you have today. And I think that's important to recognize. The convention itself builds on fundamental principles that are already well established in international law to an extent. We have the notion of jus cogens, which are the fundamental human rights that prohibit things that we generally agree to as being criminal, like genocide, like slavery, like murder, torture, prolonged arbitrary detention, racial discrimination, things like that. The problem is finding a mechanism to enforce these. We have certain international instruments that deal with certain situations, but the convention that we're talking about would require of signatories to establish criminal liability and accountability as a matter of national law. That's what it's about. And in order to do that, it has defined several items of criminality. I just mentioned apartheid is one. Others deal with forced detention. Others deal with an aggregated assault on a particular ethnic group. Things like that I've just mentioned that in some ways are part of our international legal framework. But the idea is to render these accountable at the national level among signatories. Now, it's important to note, and the role of the bars in this is to help analyze and address these issues with their governments. I mentioned that the ABA has regular connectivity with, to use the word, with the State Department, with congressional leaders, and so forth. We have ABA Day. We have ABA Day at the UN, ABA Day on the Hill. When I chaired the UN representatives, we had regular conversations with other NGOs, with the State Department to express our priorities. We've expressed also, some 10 years ago, the ABA adopted in principle a resolution calling for such a convention, on which we now have the draft. And what we're doing with the American Bar Association and our working group, as we're trying to do with the IBA as well, is get commentary from these bars to help inform our leaders as to what negotiating posture they should take. The other thing we do as bars is to convey the notion that lawyers are part of the solution, not the problem. You know, Shakespeare is often misquoted for his commentary about the first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers. It was not meant to be an attack on lawyers. It was meant to show that lawyers are the vanguard, or perhaps last defense, for the rule of law. And the idea that lawyers can explain to the public why this type of convention is needed is important. It helps change the paradigm for the receptivity of it. I would also note that when we provide substantive commentary, we also help facilitate the passage of this. You know, one of the concerns about the convention is that people will let the perfect become the enemy of the good. There are some people who would like to see criminalization of ecocide or other types of more controversial issues as a crime against humanity. And we've been doing programs at the IBA as well as within the ABA, such as this, on what the convention does and does not do. And when we speak with the United Nations personnel at UN Day, we ask them, you know, what are the flashpoints? And we hear things like protection of sovereignty, due process, jurisdictional issues. These are where the bars and lawyers really serve a purpose. It's an educative factor. It's to allay concerns and also look for perhaps language that may help facilitate the passage of national legislation. Among the issues we want to deal with, for example, are issues of avoiding double jeopardy. So there we would involve our criminal law experts within the bars to help address these issues. I would simply also make a final point at this time that since we've heard about the United States and so forth, the convention is not a woke or anti-woke issue. It's a fundamental issue dealing with something that we all really do generally agree on. We have statutes in the United States, going back to the founding of the Republic, the Alien Tort Act, for example. We have anti-torture statutes that provide civil causes of action. We have it recognized within the institutional framework of the United States, a philosophy that the types of crimes we're talking about are not acceptable. So we need in our presentations and in our work by the bars to focus on rule of law issues, jus cogens, what's already part of the international framework, and try to steer towards a consensus of the possible rather than making it an all or nothing approach by the bars. As I said, we went on record 10 years ago with the ABA that we endorsed this. We've already passed our gender apartheid resolution. We're working on we have a placeholder resolution to endorse the involvement of civil society, and we will continue. So I do think we play an important part. I recognize the challenges that Baroness Kennedy outlined, but I do believe that we continue to have a structure and we shine a light that helps us move the paradigm towards where we want it to be.
Can I respond just very briefly? Stephen speaks for the best of American lawyering, United States lawyering, and I have worked with him closely and admire him enormously. And I must say that I think that many of you have been doing incredibly great and brave work in protecting all those great things that the United States has stood for in terms of law internationally. But of course, when we're talking about getting a convention through, I smile when Stephen reminds us that 10 years ago, the American Bar Association signed up to this possible convention. And 10 years on, here we are still talking about it. And of course, I mean, that is the wheels of the United Nations grind slowly in any of these things. But I suspect that they're going to continue to grind rather slowly on this particular convention. Because I mean, let's look at who's on the Security Council. Let's look at the leading voices, and I suspect that we're not going to get the kind of, if you like, the movement that we would have wanted to see in these coming years. I think there's going to be yet further delay before we get this convention. But it's not to say that we don't keep on with the struggle and having the voices of bar associations everywhere that want to bring this into being. But I also wanted to just say that, Stephen, you have to understand that many people in Europe at the moment are feeling quite gutted at the way in which we've experienced ourselves being described as nations in deep decline because we've allowed high levels of immigration, or is it that high? We have elderly populations where our own we're not reproducing children at any great rate. We need to survival involves, I think, as your nation can proudly tell, needs immigration in order to have that great diversity and the new ideas that come with new peoples and the living together and the great fertilization of thought that comes through that, as well as everything else. And so, but to hear ourselves described in the way that in which we've just been described by our great ally and friend, the United States, is pretty painful, I have to tell you.
And I don't defend the rhetoric. I don't defend all of that.
I'm just going to pause you both because this is a good
we've got Leila
interjectory
with us,
point to have Leila jump in.
It's thrilling to see Leila. I'm thrilled to see you, Leila.
This is perfect.
We missed you at the beginning, but I've had my little bit of sadness about the national security strategy and how it was greeted by President Putin and the great business of the new very tight friendship that's developing between the United States and Russia, which is actually not so friendly towards us in Europe either. So there's a great feeling of discomfort here in Europe, across the legal communities, but I suspect across the political communities by and large, except those that perhaps share some of these views.
Right. Perfect. So Leila, can you bring us, originally I was going to have you give us a trajectory of what this journey towards the draft convention has been like. You can do a bit of that as you see fit, but I primarily want you to focus on where we are now in the process, what's going right, how we're going forward, and what we can look forward to in 2026, especially with this climate of shifting alliances and support and all the things.
Yes, and my sincere apologies. I have been traveling. I'm
No
on a
worries.
borrowed computer.
We're just
I've been
glad to have
traveling.
you.
I was in The Hague last week at the ICC ASP. I was giving a keynote at Minnesota. I'm actually in New York attending meetings at the United Nations this week. And so I'm completely discombobulated in terms of time zone. But what I do want to say, having listened to the tenor of the discussion, is I'm really hopeful about the future, actually. Happy Human Rights Day. It is a gloomy time in so many ways. ways. We can feel some of the human rights crises just crashing in over our heads. But let me talk a little bit about this process and why the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty does give us a lot of hope for the future. Obviously, we know about the negative things happening, but let me tell you about some of the positive things, which is that the campaign for this treaty, which was started by me in 2008, has now resulted with a huge global coalition coming from the global south, led by Mexico, the Gambia, a core group of states. In 2022, we had a huge breakthrough getting a consensus resolution through the Sixth Committee of the UN General Assembly to spend 2 years basically discussing the draft articles that came from the International Law Commission. And what they did is they broke, and this is important for the future, which is why I'm backing up a little. They broke the treaty, the draft, into 5 clusters, what we call clusters. And the clusters cover everything from mutual legal assistance and cooperation to the definition of the crime to human rights, protections like Steve was talking about. So the 5 clusters were debated for 2 years by the General Assembly. And then in 2024, last year, we got Resolution 79/122, which sets out a structured, inclusive, transparent, and comprehensive framework for taking this treaty to the final negotiation stage and concluding it. So I don't think that the Security Council is going to have much to say about this treaty. I think it's in the General Assembly. Voting is the rule of the day in the General Assembly. Of course, there will be pressure placed upon states. Of course, there will be states that will come in with regressive proposals, just like we're hearing states coming in with very progressive proposals. States have until right now, I'm in New York. We're going to hear what the final modalities are for the PrepCom that opens January 19th, 2026. That meeting is actually being held tomorrow. And tomorrow I'll attend that meeting. But what we do know is that civil society will be allowed to attend. There'll be a 2-week preparatory conference committee that will meet, that will break into working groups in the afternoon. So the first couple of days are going to be plenary remarks by states. There's some debate. Do states really need to make their speeches, or should they get right into the clusters? Because they're going to use the same breakdown of the clusters to divide the work into tranches. And states then have until April 30th to submit formal proposals. Those will then be compiled, and that compilation will be sent to a diplomatic conference. There'll be a second PrepCom in 2027 that'll be much shorter, only 4 days in April, and that's going to develop rules of procedure for the conference. Right now, we know the PrepCom is chaired by Ireland, which I think was an excellent choice. The Bureau will include as vice chairs Mexico and the Gambia, who are the 2 states that led the resolution going forward. And then Cyprus and Ukraine will also be members of the Bureau. And we have learned there will probably also be a coordinator who will be sort of an individual tasked as kind of a focal point to try to bring states together where there are points of divergence. What we heard in the General Assembly in October 13th, 14th of this year, when the Sixth Committee met, we assumed that there would be very little discussion because Resolution 79/122, adopted in 24, actually set out the entire framework. And in fact, we had 128 states speak, which was extraordinary. And of those 128, only 4 were negative. So I don't hear the negativity coming through about this treaty. There is negativity in the atmosphere, right? There are terrible things happening on the planet. But I think the concept that we can finally agree that humanity deserves a treaty for its protection in wartime and peacetime is a concept that's galvanizing states, and it's really galvanizing civil society. I'm hearing that from the Africa group, which initially didn't participate much at all. I'm hearing that from GRULAC. I'm hearing that from Western European and others. We're hearing it even from Asia Pacific. And to Stephen's point, it may not be ecocide. Ecocide is a rhetorical word. It's not an actual legal concept, in my view, even though there's an ecocide campaign. But I think Vanuatu and many other states would like to see environmental harm as a crime against humanity included in the draft, which is not controversial at all. It was actually in the 1991 Draft Code of Crimes of the International Law Commission. It's an old idea. It's well over 30 years old. I suspect, having listened to the debates, ad nauseum or very carefully for the past 6 years in the General Assembly. We will see modest additions. The additions are very important because they galvanize civil society and they also respond to modern day harms. The big ones, I think, this is just a prediction, the ones I see going into the draft treaty is starvation as a crime against humanity because it's a crime we're seeing committed. And it's not just about the death, it's about the torture it inflicts on parents that can't feed their children. It's about the stunted brain development and bone development, right? Starvation is a horrible crime that's occurring in at least two conflicts right now on the planet, Sudan and Gaza, and it's awful. I think we're going to see environmental harm advocated for by a group of states. I think there's a gender apartheid campaign that's going to work very hard to try to get that, and not just gender apartheid, but crimes like forced marriage, which has already been adjudicated, and other inhumane act. I think forced marriage is likely to be added. And the other crimes that we're starting to see sort of percolating that states are very interesting. I think the campaign to include the slave trade is an excellent campaign led by Sierra Leone and Global South states. It's kind of a no-brainer. It's in the 1926 Slavery Convention, so it's a codification of existing customary international law and treaty law. It's not a new crime. So I think the things we will see in terms of new crimes are either crimes that respond to actual harms we're seeing in the planet today, or crimes that historically were left out for a variety of reasons when the Rome Statute was negotiated. I'm old enough that I was there when the Rome Statute was actually negotiated, and I remember why certain things were in and certain things were out. And we have to remember that this treaty, and this will be my final thought, this treaty is an interstate convention. It doesn't create an international court about which states could be worried and that needs to have a very comprehensive jurisdictional framework. This is about empowering states to do the work themselves. And so I think we will have some challenging negotiations, of course, because there will be many, many debates about the tenor of specific provisions that are in the draft articles or haven't yet been included that'll be proposed. But I think those challenges can be overcome because what I'm sensing in the General Assembly, and as I say, I've been covering this for a long time now, we had 2 minutes of sustained applause when that resolution was adopted last year. 2 minutes. People were practically in tears. And we heard the explanations after the vote. There was consensus, so there was no actual vote. We heard from Iran. We heard from Czechia. We heard from states that you don't expect to talk about their enthusiasm for a treaty on crimes against humanity. And I think it's because all of us do share, we all breathe the same air. We all understand that we're human at the end of the day, and that this treaty responds to the needs of all human beings and the right of all human beings to live in peace, to live in security, and to have their dignity and human rights respected. And that's really what this treaty at the end of the day is going to be about. It's going to be about honoring the survivors and victims of these crimes and establishing a comprehensive interstate legal framework for their prevention and punishment. So I'm very sorry again, apologies for my
No worries.
jet-lagged state, but it's such an honor to be here with you, Stephen, and with you, Baroness Kennedy, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
We're just happy to have you all here. So I'd like to get to all three of you intervening on your behalf for each of your comments, but I'd like to take one quick question from the floor about process with regards to the convention. So this is from Rebecca Shute. The summer special session of the Assembly of States Parties to the ICC saw some setbacks with regard to advocacy to advance the effort to harmonize jurisdiction over the crime, with the U.S. in particular saying it would use any means necessary to impede advancement and a group of member states opposing progress. Are there any lessons learned to avoid similar obstructions during the critical period for the treaty? Starting with you, Leila, and then I guess we can open it to anyone else as well.
Well, if states look right now, The state that has been the most difficult in these negotiations up to now has been the Russian Federation. And so I'm just going to talk about them. I'm putting a pin in the United States just because they're not very active right now, so that's fine. So the Russian Federation dissociated from it's the one state that's problematic. It dissociated from the resolution in 2024. It dissociated this year. The Russian Federation has raised objections to the participation of civil society, right? We're the ones that watch what's happening. We're the ones that publicize what's happening. And so we do expect a fight on a lot of the issues from not just the Russian Federation. China's not very keen on civil society participation either. So I do expect a small number of states to be obstructive. What I'm really grateful for is that the International Law Commission draft is an excellent starting point. I don't honestly think that states are going to be able to water down a lot of those draft provisions. I do think there will be campaigns to do so. I think universal jurisdiction is something that we've heard complaints about. Some states arguing for priorities of jurisdiction. Some states arguing that consensus should be the rule in decision making, which we know will produce a lowest common denominator treaty. But at the end of the day, the resolution that was crafted does a couple of things. It ensures that the default rules of procedure are the General Assembly's normal rules, which require voting. So there will be voting. And at least right now, looking at New York, we have the votes for a good treaty. Now that could change, and I'm not saying a perfect treaty. I agree with Stephen. You can't make the best be the enemy of the good, but we have the votes for a perfectly good treaty. And the procedural rules are going to involve voting. Will there be regressive campaigns? China has suggested crimes against humanity have to be linked to armed conflict. I think that's a dead letter. I don't see us going back to the Nuremberg trials. I think we have, 35 years of jurisprudence now that says that's not the case. And I don't think states are going to go there. So I think we're going to be able to preserve what exists. And the challenge then will be, can we advance the ball? I think the only other area that I'm watching carefully where I think we could have a regressive movement is on the question of immunities, because heads of states love to be immune these days. They're all arguing they're immune from everything. And I am not a pro-immunity person. I am a pro-accountability person. I'm evaluated by every student in every course that I teach every semester. Everybody should have to account for their actions, whether they're the president or prime minister of a country, or they're just a low-level army officer. And so I think we are going to have a big fight on immunities. I can hear that at the International Criminal Court, where the Trump administration is trying to push states that are parties to the ICC to say that there is immunity for non-state party nationals. And I think immunities is one of the areas that we're going to have to really be doing some advocacy around. Other than that, I think we're going to get a pretty good treaty.
Baroness, you looked like you had something to say earlier. Would you like to intervene?
I think Leila.
Stephen too. Okay.
I think yes, of course. I think Leila has done the most incredible work on this, and we need her to continue to feel optimistic and so on. But you see, I just don't share this kind of optimism at the moment, because I think that the way in which there is a sort of hurrying for the national security strategy that's just been outlined is actually a retreat from that rules-based order. I think that we're going to see less and less participation by many of the, I think that certainly the major states that have places on the Security Council are going to be uncooperative in creating any new law in this space, which is around human rights. They don't like human rights, and there's a sort of I think there's a sort of step back from human rights. I find myself more often talking about the rule of law and the vital importance of the rule of law, and that the rule of law applies across nations as well as inside nations. And because one knows that you only have to mention human rights, and with certain people, they're deeply allergic to it. So I don't think that this convention is going to happen anytime soon, but I want to add my support to Leila, and I will, of course, continue to advocate strongly for it. and we will continue working with nations that are not drinking the Kool-Aid on, nationalistic, inward-looking, isolationist. There's only great powers, and that the realignment of the world, that whole fantasy, and that, well, it might not even be a fantasy; it might turn into reality. But I will. I don't think, we as lawyers all do this business of saying, we're not political. Sometimes law becomes political because when the not being political means not observing law and providing immunities for all these folk, that there's a problem. So we've got to get real and accept the fact that, unfortunately, politics sometimes interferes with the rule of law because people do not want to play by the rules. And that's the difficulty. And there will always be people who don't want to play by the rules. And the richer you become, the more likely you are to not want to play by the rules. And we're seeing more and more of that globally. And we're going to have to keep holding the rein. And we can smile as much as we like. But in fact, it's going to be a very, very hard job. And we're all going to have to be shoulder to shoulder in trying to do this.
Go on, Stephen. Thank you for that, Baroness. Thank you.
Well, it's too long for optimism, but I'll take all the realistic points that are made. But the alternative is to give up. And I think that we all need to continue to do this. When the ABA endorsed in 2014 the concept of this treaty, and now, yes, it's 10, 11 years later, it's a blink of an eye in the course of human history. And while real people are suffering individually in real places, I appreciate that. But short of military intervention, the notion of the convention and rule of law and domestic criminal law and accountability, building on the consensus that we've heard about, the time has come, and maybe it won't be in our lifetimes. I think we'll see the treaty sooner than that, but if not, I don't think there's any going back. I think we've established a certain mindset towards this. And yes, I agree, there are bad people doing bad things, but the alternative is not acceptable. We have to continue to push this. So that's my only comment. I can't argue the realities of what people are saying and doing, Baroness, but I can argue for, in our small way, trying to do what we can do within the mechanisms and the instruments we have before us. That's all I think some of this can do.
Tiffani, could I add one thing
Yes, of course,
to what
of course.
Stephen said?
Please,
I just want to say, because I didn't have the chance to say it, that right now the treaty framework provides in the resolution that the treaty will be concluded in 2029. There is a PrepCom in 27, a 3-week diplomatic conference in 28, and a second 3-week diplomatic conference in 2029. They actually picked 2029 in some ways on purpose. There could be changes in administrations and changes in governments, but I agree with Stephen. I think the train has left the station. It's not going to be whether we get the convention. It's going to be what kind of convention we get at this point. So I hope that I'm right. And Baroness Kennedy, thank you so much for telling us to stay strong, because that's how we feel here in New York. Thank you.
Listen, look, our world is going through a very, very difficult period. I don't want, this is not burying one's head in the sand. That's not how I am. I've spent my life fighting to advance the rights of people who haven't got rights. And so what I'm saying to all of you is that I've been hugely admiring, and it's why I have a home in the United States as well as in the UK. I love the United States. I have admired its legal system, and in fact became a leading voice in wanting constitutional change in Britain because of my experience of your country and law. And so to come and speak at the American Bar Association, so it's close to my heart. You are the people from whom I learned. I just want to say it's going to be a hard fight, and let's not just imagine that it's not. And I wouldn't use the word Pollyannish. Stephen said he's not a Pollyanna. I wouldn't use that term, But I think that, we've got to be realistic about just how intense the struggle is going to be to protect human rights, to protect what we've already got. Never mind advancing what we've got. And yes, there's a journey on which we will be traveling, but there's going to be a lot of difficult stuff along the way. And one of the most fundamental things that we thought we all believed in was that it didn't matter how powerful you were, you shouldn't be above the law. I mean, it goes back to the kings in England, King John and Magna Carta. The idea that one of the purposes of law is to constrain power, and most of this stuff is about power. And for example, you have in the United States, whether you want to face up to it or not, the advances in technology, which are going to be very, very challenging to the rights that we've already established. The idea that there should be no regulation of those platforms and so forth, in the protection of our children, in the protection of our private lives, and the protection of our civil rights and so on. We're going to be facing some serious challenges, and the only way that we as lawyers can function is to be fighting the cases, but also alerting the general public. We are the servants of the public in this regard, is to be alerting them to the ways in which those things are going to be happening. And so I'm saying to all of you is that, we can make nice noises to each other, and we can turn up at conferences and chat and say we're not going to be discussing politics, because that's not what we lawyers do. But the problem is that if we're seeing erosions of the struggles that we had, we have to remember, here we are on the day that is celebrating, or the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Nobody was perfect at the time. You guys in the United States had Jim Crow law. We in Britain were colonizing whole parts of Africa and Asia, and ill-treating people. Russia had gulags. Nobody was coming to this with clean hands, but there was an aspiration that we would keep on a struggle to try and make the world a better place. And there are going to be advances and hiccups in all of that, but the only way that we're going to do it is by doing it and across borders, but not by smiling and saying it's all happening and the train's going and we'll get there in the end. We will get there in the end, but my God, we may be very disappointed at some of the disruptions that there may be on the way.
Baroness, thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you for this very powerful and honest, quite frankly, conversation about both the optimistic aspects of this process, what the realistic parts of this landscape look like, and all the hard work to go forward. I appreciate your candor and your collegiality, and I want to thank you all for coming. Hopefully this will be a conversation that gets continued, and obviously I know it will in many other forums, maybe again with us here at the ABA. Please join us for our next panel if you can. There's a link in the chat box for joining that, about human rights defenders and refugees. And again, we've been very privileged and honored to host you all here and to have everyone attend as they have. Happy Human Rights Day, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Tiffani.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tiffani.